Innocent father sentenced to death, a heart-wrenching nightmare no one should face. But just when it seems like all hope is lost, something unbelievable happens. His German shepherd, loyal to a fault, does the unthinkable, breaking every law of possibility to save him. How does a dog become the hero in a fight for justice? And can one man and his dog defy the impossible, exposing a hidden betrayal that could change everything? Don't miss this gripping story of loyalty, redemption, and a love that goes beyond words. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The morning sun filtered through the dusty windows of Hayes Auto Repair, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. Jonathan Hayes wiped his brow with the back of his hand, leaving a small streak of grease above his eyebrow. The familiar smell of motor oil and metal filled the air as he leaned over the engine of Mrs. Peterson's old Buick. "Hand me that wrench, would you, Sarah?" Jonathan called out to his daughter, who sat at the small desk near the office door. Sarah looked up from her math textbook, her pencil tapping against the page. "Sure, Dad." She hopped off the chair and grabbed the tool from the nearby workbench. Duke, their German shepherd, lifted his head from his spot by the garage door, his tail wagging as Sarah passed by. "Thanks, sweetie." Jonathan smiled as she handed him the wrench. "How's the homework coming along?" "Almost done," Sarah said, reaching down to scratch Duke behind the ears. "These algebra problems are pretty tough, but I think I'm getting it." Jonathan nodded, pride warming his chest. At 16, Sarah was already showing the same determination that had gotten him through his own tough times. "You'll figure it out. You always do." Duke suddenly sat up, his ears perking forward. A moment later, the quiet morning was shattered by the sound of screeching tires and blaring sirens. Jonathan straightened up from the engine, his heart pounding as multiple police cars surrounded the shop, their red and blue lights flooding the garage. "What's going on?" Sarah's voice trembled as officers burst through both entrances, their weapons drawn. "Get down! Hands where we can see them!" an officer shouted. Duke lunged forward, his bark echoing off the walls as he positioned himself between the officers and his family. The German shepherd's hackles rose, his teeth bared in a threatening snarl. "Control that dog!" someone yelled. Jonathan's mind raced as he raised his hands. "Sarah, grab Duke's collar. It's okay, girl. Just stay calm." Sarah's hands shook as she gripped Duke's collar, tears streaming down her face. "Dad, what's happening?" Before Jonathan could answer, two officers grabbed his arms, roughly spinning him around and slamming him against the hood of Mrs. Peterson's Buick. The cold metal of handcuffs bit into his wrists. "Jonathan Hayes, you're under arrest," a familiar voice announced. Jonathan turned his head to see Detective Richard Calloway standing in the doorway. His childhood friend's face was a mask of professional detachment, but something else lurked in his eyes, something that made Jonathan's stomach turn. "Richard?" "What is this about?" Jonathan asked, struggling to keep his voice steady for Sarah's sake. Calloway wouldn't meet his gaze, focusing instead on his notepad. "Take him to the car," he ordered the other officers. "Dad!" Sarah screamed, trying to move forward but still struggling with Duke, who was pulling against her grip, snapping and growling at the officers. "You can't take him. He didn't do anything wrong." "Sarah, listen to me," Jonathan called out as the officers started dragging him toward the door. "Everything's going to be okay. Take care of Duke. Call Aunt Marie." Duke broke free from Sarah's grip, launching himself toward the officers holding Jonathan. His powerful jaws snapped inches from one officer's arm before another caught him with a boot to the side. "Don't hurt him," Sarah cried out, running to Duke's aid. Jonathan's heart felt like it was being torn in two as he watched his daughter drop to her knees beside their loyal dog. Duke recovered quickly, still trying to get to Jonathan, despite Sarah's attempts to hold him back. "Richard, please," Jonathan pleaded as they reached the police cruiser. "At least tell me what this is about," Let me talk to Sarah." But Calloway had already turned away, speaking into his radio as if he couldn't hear his old friend's words. The betrayal cut deep, adding another layer of fear to Jonathan's growing panic. The officers shoved Jonathan into the back of the cruiser. Through the window, he could see Sarah standing in the driveway, her arms wrapped around Duke's neck as she sobbed. The German shepherd was still barking, straining against Sarah's embrace, desperate to reach his master. As the police car pulled away from the shop, Jonathan watched his whole world shrink in the rearview mirror. Sarah grew smaller and smaller, a lonely figure with Duke by her side, until they disappeared around the corner. The helplessness crashed over him like a wave, threatening to drown him in despair. The morning that had started so normally, just another day of fixing cars and helping with homework, had shattered into something unrecognizable. Jonathan closed his eyes, trying to burn the image of Sarah's face into his memory, wondering when he would see his daughter again. The squad car's siren wailed through the small town streets, but Jonathan barely heard it over the sound of his own heartbeat. His wrists ached from the tight handcuffs, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the agony of being torn away from his child. The betrayal in Richard's averted gaze haunted him, hinting at something darker than a simple arrest. As they drove through familiar streets that now seemed alien and hostile, Jonathan's thoughts remained fixed on the image of Sarah and Duke standing in the driveway of Hayes Auto Repair, his daughter's tears, his dog's desperate attempts to protect him, and the terrible helplessness of being unable to comfort either of them. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the small interrogation room, casting harsh shadows across the metal table where Jonathan sat. His wrists were cuffed, the cold steel biting into his skin. The room smelled of stale coffee and cleaning supplies, making his stomach turn. Two detectives entered, their faces stern and businesslike. Behind them, Jonathan caught a glimpse of Richard Calloway hovering in the doorway, before quickly disappearing. The sight of his childhood friend turning away made Jonathan's chest tighten with a mix of confusion and betrayal. "Mr. Hayes," the taller detective said, dropping a thick folder onto the table. "I'm Detective Morris, and this is Detective Rodriguez. We need to talk about where you were 3 nights ago." Jonathan leaned forward, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I was home with my daughter Sarah. We had dinner, watched TV, and went to bed early. I had a busy day at the shop the next morning." Detective Rodriguez pulled out several photographs, spreading them across the table. They showed various angles of tools from Jonathan's shop, some marked with red circles. "Care to explain the blood we found on these?" Jonathan's eyes widened. "Blood? That's impossible. Those are my tools. I use them every day for repairs." "Our lab confirmed it's human blood," Morris cut in, his voice sharp. "And it matches our victim's blood type." Jonathan shook his head, feeling increasingly dizzy. "There must be some mistake. I fix cars, that's all. I've never hurt anyone in my life." The door opened again, and a new detective entered with a laptop. They set it up, turning the screen to face Jonathan. The footage was grainy, showing a figure walking down a poorly lit street. "This is security footage from near the crime scene," Rodriguez explained. "The timestamp shows 11:47 p.m., the night of the murder. The build matches yours exactly, Mr. Hayes." Jonathan squinted at the blurry image. "That could be anyone. You can't even make out a face in that footage." Hours passed, and the questions kept coming. Jonathan's throat was dry, his head pounding from the constant barrage of accusations. They brought him water, but didn't allow food, saying they needed to continue the questioning. The door opened again, and this time Richard Calloway stepped in. Jonathan's heart sank as his old friend refused to meet his eyes, instead conferring quietly with the other detectives. "Richard?" Jonathan called out, his voice cracking. "Richard, please. You know me. You know I couldn't have done this." Calloway's face remained impassive as he placed an evidence bag on the table. Inside was a handgun. "Your fingerprints are all over this weapon, Jonathan." "It was found near the crime scene." "What? I've never owned a gun in my life." Jonathan's voice rose with desperation. "Richard, we grew up together. You used to come to my house for dinner every Sunday. Sarah calls you Uncle Rich, for God's sake." Calloway finally met his gaze, but his eyes were cold and distant. Without a word, he turned and left the room, leaving Jonathan feeling more alone than ever. A middle-aged man in an expensive suit entered next, Jonathan's court-appointed attorney, Mr. Bennett. The detectives gave them a few minutes of privacy. "Mr. Hayes," Bennett said, opening his briefcase, "the situation is grave. They have physical evidence linking you to the crime scene, surveillance footage, and a murder weapon with your prints." "None of that makes sense," Jonathan insisted, leaning forward. "I was home with Sarah all night. She can verify everything. We had lasagna for dinner, watched that new superhero movie she's been wanting to see, and I helped her with her chemistry homework before bed. Check my phone records. Check anything you need to." Bennett made some notes, but looked skeptical. "The district attorney is pushing for the death penalty. They're painting you as a calculated killer who used his mechanical expertise to commit this murder." The door opened again, and a sharp-featured woman in a tailored suit strode in. "I'm District Attorney Marion Wells," she announced, her heels clicking against the floor as she approached the table. "Mr. Hayes, the evidence against you is overwhelming. We have blood, we have weapons, we have you at the scene." Jonathan felt the walls closing in. His hands trembled as he pressed them flat against the table. "None of this makes any sense. I'm innocent. I'm just a mechanic trying to raise my daughter." "A mechanic with the perfect tools to commit murder," Wells countered, her voice hard. "A mechanic who left his 16-year-old daughter alone while he went out and took someone's life." "No!" Jonathan's voice echoed off the concrete walls. "I would never leave Sarah alone at night. Never. She's all I have." Wells gathered her papers, straightening them with precise movements. "The jury will see the truth, Mr. Hayes. They'll see a man who used his skills and tools to commit a brutal murder, and they'll ensure justice is served." Jonathan watched helplessly as she strode out of the room, her confidence a stark contrast to the fear and confusion churning in his gut. The fluorescent lights continued their relentless buzzing overhead as evening settled in, marking nearly 12 hours since his world had been turned upside down. He thought of Sarah, alone at home with Duke, probably sick with worry. He thought of his shop, of the half-finished repairs he'd promised to complete. He thought of Richard Calloway, the boy who'd once shared his dreams and secrets, now refusing to even look him in the eye. The evidence mounted against him felt like a noose tightening around his neck. Every attempt to explain, every protest of innocence, seemed to fall on deaf ears. As he sat there in the harsh light of the interrogation room, Jonathan realized with growing horror that the prosecution wasn't interested in the truth. They wanted a conviction, and they'd decided he was their man. The morning sun filtered through the tall courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the polished wooden benches. Jonathan Hayes sat at the defense table, his orange jumpsuit a stark contrast to the dark wood furnishings. His hands, usually covered in engine grease, were now clean, but trembling slightly as they rested on the table. Sarah sat 3 rows back, her aunt's arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders. Duke, wearing his service vest, lay at her feet, his brown eyes fixed intently on Jonathan. The German Shepherd's presence had required special permission, but Sarah's therapist had insisted it was necessary for her emotional well-being during the trial. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs until Judge Martinez entered. her black robe sweeping behind her as she took her place at the bench. "All rise," the bailiff called out, and the shuffle of feet filled the room. "Please be seated," Judge Martinez said, her voice firm but not unkind. "We're here today for the case of the state versus Jonathan Hayes. Are both sides ready to proceed?" The prosecutor, a sharp-featured woman in a crisp navy suit, stood. "The state is ready, Your Honor." Jonathan's court-appointed defender, a younger man who looked overwhelmed by the high-stakes case, rose next. "The defense is ready, Your Honor." Sarah watched as the prosecutor approached the jury box, her heels clicking against the floor. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom. "The state will prove that on the night of March 15th, Jonathan Hayes committed a brutal murder. We will show you evidence of his guilt. Blood found on his tools, surveillance footage placing him at the scene, and the murder weapon bearing his fingerprints." Duke's ears perked up at the prosecutor's tone, and he pressed closer to Sarah's legs. She buried her fingers in his thick fur, drawing comfort from his steady presence. "This man," the prosecutor continued, pointing dramatically at Jonathan, "is not the simple mechanic he pretends to be. He is a calculating killer who thought he could get away with murder. By the end of this trial, you will see the monster behind the mask." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Monster? This was her father they were talking about, the man who still cut the crusts off her sandwiches even though she was 16, who taught her how to change a tire when she was 12, who rescued Duke from the shelter when he was just a puppy. The defense attorney's opening statement felt weak in comparison. He spoke about Jonathan's clean record, his reputation in the community, his dedication as a single father. But his words lacked the conviction of the prosecutor's accusations. As the morning progressed, the prosecution began presenting their evidence. They showed photographs of the blood-stained tools, though Jonathan's attorney pointed out that no DNA testing had conclusively matched the blood to the victim. They played the grainy surveillance footage, but even on the courtroom's large screen, the figure was impossible to identify with certainty. When they brought out the gun in its evidence bag, Sarah felt her aunt's grip on her shoulder tighten. The prosecutor held it up for the jury to see. "This weapon, found near the crime scene, bears the defendant's fingerprints. Expert testimony will confirm this match." From his position at the defense table, Jonathan shook his head slightly, his face pale but composed. Sarah could read the confusion and disbelief in his expression. She knew her father had never owned a gun, had never even wanted one in their home. Detective Richard Calloway sat in the back of the courtroom, observing the proceedings with an unreadable expression. As the gun evidence was presented, Duke's head suddenly snapped toward him. The German shepherd's fur bristled, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. The unexpected sound cut through the courtroom like a knife. All heads turned toward the source of the noise. Duke stood up, his eyes locked on Calloway, continuing to growl, a sound Sarah had never heard him make except when he sensed real danger. "Order!" Judge Martinez called, tapping her gavel. "Young lady, please control your dog." "Duke, quiet," Sarah whispered, tugging gently on his vest. But Duke remained focused on Calloway, his posture rigid with alertness. Detective Calloway shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his face growing pale. He wouldn't meet anyone's eyes, especially not Jonathan's, who had turned to look at his former friend with a mixture of hurt and dawning suspicion. The prosecutor tried to recover the moment, launching into a detailed timeline of the alleged crime. But something had changed in the courtroom. Several jurors were glancing between Duke and Detective Calloway, their expressions thoughtful. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah felt increasingly helpless watching the prosecution build their case against her father. Every piece of evidence seemed circumstantial, yet it was being presented as irrefutable proof. Her father's alibi, that he had been home with her all evening, was dismissed as the unreliable testimony of a devoted daughter trying to protect her father. By 4 o'clock, Judge Martinez checked her watch. "We'll adjourn for today and resume tomorrow morning at 9, she announced, tapping her gavel. As the courtroom began to clear, Sarah held on to Duke tightly, her mind racing. The dog's unusual reaction to Detective Calloway kept replaying in her thoughts. Duke had always been friendly with Calloway during his visits to their house. What had changed? Why had he growled like that? She watched as Calloway hurried out of the courtroom, practically running from Duke's accusing stare. Her father was led away by the bailiff, managing to give her a small, brave smile, before disappearing through the side door. Sarah buried her face in Duke's fur, fighting back tears. The dog turned his head to lick her cheek, his earlier aggression completely gone now that Calloway had left. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Duke knew something important that could help prove her father's innocence. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the courthouse windows, painting stark lines across the worn wooden benches. Sarah's hand trembled as she gripped her father's, their fingers intertwined in a desperate embrace. The courtroom air felt thick and heavy, making it difficult to breathe. Duke lay at their feet, his brown eyes alert and watchful. Jonathan Hayes sat rigid in his chair, his face pale and drawn. The past few hours of jury deliberation had felt like an eternity. His court-appointed lawyer shuffled papers nervously beside him, but Jonathan barely noticed. His entire world had narrowed to the warmth of Sarah's hand in his and the steady presence of Duke against his leg. The bailiff's voice cut through the silence. "All rise." Sarah's grip tightened as they stood. Judge Martinez entered, her expression unreadable beneath her stern exterior. "Please be seated," she commanded, and the rustle of movement filled the courtroom. From his position near the prosecutor's table, Detective Calloway watched with an intensity that made Sarah's skin crawl. Duke's ears flattened slightly, a low rumble building in his chest. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Martinez asked. The jury foreman, a middle-aged man in a gray suit, stood. "We have, Your Honor." Sarah's heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. Jonathan closed his eyes briefly, his prayer silent but desperate. Duke shifted restlessly at their feet, sensing the mounting tension. "On the count of first-degree murder, how do you find the defendant?" The foreman's voice rang out clear and devastating. "We find the defendant guilty." The word hit like a physical blow. Sarah's knees buckled, and she gripped her father's hand harder. Jonathan stood frozen, his face ashen, as if he couldn't quite process what he'd just heard. "No!" Sarah's voice cracked through the courtroom. "No, you can't. He's innocent." Duke burst into loud barking, responding to Sarah's distress. The courtroom erupted into chaos as Judge Martinez banged her gavel repeatedly. "Order! Order in the court!" But before order could be restored, Judge Martinez's voice cut through the chaos with the words that would destroy their world completely. "The sentence for this crime is death by lethal injection." Sarah's scream pierced the air. "You can't do this! He's innocent! Dad!" She lunged forward, but court officers moved to restrain her. In that moment, Duke's protective instincts took over. The German shepherd broke free from his restraint, launching himself across the courtroom with a fierce growl. His target was clear: Detective Calloway. The dog's intuition, which had been warning them all along, now exploded into action. Calloway's face drained of color as Duke charged toward him, teeth bared. Officers rushed to intercept the dog, managing to grab him just before he reached the detective. Duke struggled against their hold, barking and snarling at Calloway with unprecedented aggression. "Get that animal out of my courtroom," Judge Martinez ordered. Sarah fought against the officers, holding her back, her face red with anger and desperation. "Duke knows! He knows you're lying!" she shouted at Calloway, who refused to meet her gaze. Jonathan stood in shocked silence as officers approached with handcuffs. The cold metal clicked around his wrists, the sound somehow final and devastating. "Sarah," he managed to say, his voice breaking. "Sarah, be strong. Daddy, please, don't let them take you." Sarah's struggles grew more desperate as she watched them lead her father away. Duke's barking became more frantic, matching Sarah's distress. The courthouse hallway seemed endless as Jonathan was led away. He could still hear Sarah's cries echoing behind him, could still hear Duke's protective barks. Each step felt like walking through quicksand, his legs heavy with disbelief and despair. The holding cell was small and cold. Jonathan sat on the hard metal bench, his head in his hands. The reality of what had just happened began to sink in, each breath becoming more difficult than the last. His thoughts weren't of himself or the fate that awaited him, but of Sarah, his beautiful, brave daughter who would now face the world alone. Looking up at the plain concrete walls, Jonathan whispered a prayer. Not for himself, not for mercy or salvation, but for Sarah. "Please," he murmured, his voice barely audible in the empty cell. "Keep her safe. Give her strength. Don't let this break her spirit." The heavy steel door slammed shut with a resounding clang, the sound echoing through the small space. Jonathan sat alone in his cell, the weight of his sentence pressing down on him like a physical force. The reality of his situation, the death sentence, the false conviction, the separation from Sarah, seemed too enormous to comprehend. Outside his cell, he could hear the muffled sounds of the justice system continuing its relentless march forward. But inside, time seemed to stand still as Jonathan faced the terrifying reality of his imminent execution. His thoughts filled with images of Sarah's tear-stained face and Duke's desperate attempt to expose the truth. Sarah sat curled up on the worn leather couch, her knees pulled tight against her chest. The living room of their temporary home felt cold and empty, despite the warmth of the summer evening seeping through the windows. Duke paced restlessly across the hardwood floor, his nails clicking with each step. His food bowl sat untouched in the corner, the kibble growing stale. Duke, please eat something," Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. The German shepherd paused briefly to look at her, his brown eyes filled with an intensity she couldn't quite understand. Then he resumed his pacing, moving from the front door to the windows and back again. The television droned quietly in the background, its blue light casting strange shadows on the walls. Sarah hadn't meant to leave it on the news, but she couldn't bring herself to change the channel when they started discussing her father's case. The reporters spoke in cold, detached voices about evidence and testimony, treating her father's life like just another story to fill the evening broadcast. Duke's low growl startled her. He stood rigid, staring at the screen where Detective Calloway's face appeared. The detective spoke confidently about the case, his words careful and measured as he described the investigation. But something in his eyes made Sarah's stomach turn. "I know, boy," she murmured, watching as Duke's hackles rose. "I don't trust him either." The doorbell rang, making them both jump. Duke's growl deepened as Sarah approached the door. Through the peephole, she saw a letter carrier holding an official-looking envelope. Her hands shook as she opened the envelope. The courthouse letterhead seemed to mock her as she unfolded the paper inside. The words blurred together at first, but then they came into sharp focus. "Notice of transfer. Death row unit." "No," Sarah whispered, her knees growing weak. "No, no, no." Duke pressed against her legs as she fumbled for her phone, his solid presence keeping her upright. She dialed their lawyer's number from memory, praying he would answer despite the late hour. "Mr. Peterson, I'm sorry to call so late, but—" Her voice cracked. "They're moving Dad to death row tomorrow. There has to be something we can do." The lawyer's voice was gentle but tired. "Sarah, we're already working on an appeal, but these things take time, sometimes years. I know that's not what you want to hear." "Years?" Sarah interrupted, her free hand clutching the letter. "He doesn't have years. They're going to kill him for something he didn't do." "I understand you're upset," Mr. Peterson said carefully. "But the appeals process is complicated. We need new evidence, something concrete that proves your father's innocence." Duke's sudden bark cut through their conversation. He stood at attention, his ears forward and his body tense. Another growl rumbled in his chest, deeper than before. "Mr. Peterson, I have to go," Sarah said quickly. "Please, please don't give up on Dad." She barely heard his response before Duke bolted toward the front door, scratching at the wood and whining urgently. Sarah had never seen him act this way. It was as if something was calling to him, pulling him into the darkness beyond their porch. "Duke, wait!" She fumbled with the door lock, but the moment it clicked open, Duke burst through. His powerful body disappeared into the night, leaving Sarah standing in the doorway. The street lights cast yellow pools on the empty sidewalk. A warm breeze carried the scent of summer flowers, but Sarah barely noticed. Her heart pounded as she watched Duke's silhouette vanish around the corner. "Duke!" she called out, her voice echoing in the quiet neighborhood. "Duke, come back!" But the German Shepherd was gone. Sarah stood on the porch, her bare feet cold against the concrete. The court letter crumpled in her fist as realization dawned. Duke wasn't running away. He was searching for something, or someone. Her last hope disappeared into the darkness with him, leaving her alone with the weight of tomorrow's transfer hanging over her head. The porch light buzzed overhead as Sarah stared into the night, willing Duke to return, knowing somehow that his instincts were leading him exactly where he needed to go. The television continued to murmur behind her, Detective Calloway's voice drifting through the open door. Duke's food bowl remained untouched, and Sarah's phone felt heavy in her hand. She couldn't shake the feeling that Duke knew something they didn't, something that might save her father's life. As midnight approached, Sarah remained on the porch, calling Duke's name into the darkness. But only silence answered, broken occasionally by distant traffic and the gentle rustle of leaves in the summer breeze. Her father's face floated in her mind. His kind eyes, his gentle smile, his unwavering love for her. And she knew she couldn't give up. Not now. Not ever. Duke was out there somewhere, following a trail that only he could sense. Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, watching and waiting, knowing that her faithful companion had become her last thread of hope in a world that seemed determined to take everything away from her. The fluorescent lights in Jonathan's cell flickered dimly, casting an eerie glow across the cramped space. He sat on the edge of his thin mattress, his shoulders hunched against the cold concrete walls. The morning air felt heavy with tension, as whispers about Duke's escape rippled through the cell block. "Hey, Hayes, heard your dog's giving the guards a run for their money," an inmate called out from somewhere down the corridor. Jonathan didn't respond, his mind racing with thoughts of Duke out there alone. Two guards passed by his cell, their boots echoing against the metal walkway. "Can you believe it?" one of them chuckled. "A German Shepherd outsmarting our security systems makes us look like amateurs." "That's one smart mutt," the other guard replied, shaking his head. "Been all over the news. Nobody can figure out how he got past the perimeter sensors." Jonathan's heart clenched at their words. Duke had always been intelligent, but this was different. This was dangerous. He closed his eyes, remembering how Duke used to lay by his feet in the auto shop, always alert, always watching. Now his faithful companion was out there somewhere, alone in the darkness. As the day wore on, more rumors filtered through the prison. Some inmates claimed Duke had been spotted near the courthouse. Others swore they'd seen him prowling around the police station. Each new story made Jonathan's anxiety grow stronger. "Your dog's become quite the celebrity," his cellmate remarked during lunch. "Even the warden's talking about it." Jonathan picked at his food, unable to eat. Part of him felt a surge of pride at Duke's determination, but fear gnawed at his insides. What if something happened to Duke? What if he got hurt trying to help? Sarah had already lost her father. She couldn't lose Duke, too. The afternoon dragged by with agonizing slowness. Guards continued to joke about the situation, their laughter echoing through the corridors. "Well, maybe we should hire the dog for security," one quipped. "Seems better at it than half our staff." Meanwhile, across town, Duke moved like a shadow through the darkened streets. His powerful nose led him through familiar neighborhoods, past closed shops and quiet houses. Every sense was alert, his muscles tense with purpose. He avoided the main roads, sticking to alleyways and side streets where fewer people would notice him. The auto shop loomed ahead, its windows dark and empty. Yellow police tape still crossed the entrance, fluttering slightly in the night breeze. Duke slipped underneath it easily, his paws silent on the concrete floor. The shop smelled different now, stale and abandoned, with lingering traces of police and crime scene investigators. He moved methodically through the space, his nose working overtime, past the tool bench where Jonathan used to work, past the office where Sarah did her homework. The scents of his family were fading, but something else caught his attention. Something wrong, something that didn't belong. In the back corner, a stack of old tires stood gathering dust. Duke's ears perked up as he approached them. The smell here was different, earth and metal and something else, something hidden. With determined focus, Duke began to dig. His powerful paws moved the tires aside one by one, revealing the concrete floor beneath. The smell grew stronger, drawing him to a specific spot. He scratched at the ground, his claws scraping against something buried underneath. The night grew deeper as Duke worked, his breathing heavy but quiet. His instincts told him this was important. This was what he'd been searching for. Whatever lay buried here could help Jonathan, could bring him home. As he continued to dig, Duke remained vigilant. His ears swiveled at every sound from the street outside, his body ready to react at the slightest sign of danger. He knew he couldn't be discovered, not yet. Not until he had what he needed. Back in his cell, Jonathan stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The prison had grown quiet, but his mind was loud with worry. Somewhere out there, Duke was searching. Somewhere in the darkness, his loyal friend was fighting for him. Jonathan pressed his palms against his eyes, trying to push back tears of frustration and fear. "Please be careful, Duke," he whispered into the darkness. "Please stay safe." In the auto shop, Duke stood guard over his discovery, his eyes fixed on the street outside. Years of protecting his family had taught him patience. He knew what needed to be done next. The evidence lay exposed beneath the moved tires, waiting to be retrieved. Duke's muscles remained tense, ready. He wouldn't leave until he was certain he could safely take what he'd found. Sarah jolted awake at the sound of scratching at her front door. The dim light of dawn barely filtered through her curtains as she stumbled out of bed, her heart pounding. The scratching grew more insistent, followed by a familiar whine that made her breath catch in her throat. "Duke?" she whispered, rushing to the door. When she pulled it open, there stood Duke, his normally pristine coat matted with dirt and leaves. His sides heaved with exhaustion, and his paws were caked in mud. But what caught Sarah's attention was the object dangling from his mouth, a rusted keychain that glinted dully in the early morning light. Sarah dropped to her knees, wrapping her arms around Duke's neck. "Where have you been? I've been so worried." Her voice cracked with emotion as she buried her face in his fur, not caring about the dirt that transferred to her pajamas. Duke whined softly and dropped the keychain into her lap. Sarah picked it up with trembling fingers, wiping away the grime to reveal worn initials etched into the metal. MR. Her breath caught in her throat. Those initials, she knew them. They belonged to Michael Reynolds, Detective Calloway's partner, who had been heavily involved in her father's case. The same detective who had supposedly found the murder weapon with her father's fingerprints. "Duke," she whispered, her voice shaking, "where did you find this?" The German shepherd's intelligent eyes met hers, and he panted heavily, still catching his breath from what must have been an exhausting journey. Sarah quickly filled his water bowl and grabbed some leftover chicken from the fridge, watching as he gulped down both with desperate intensity. As Duke ate, Sarah examined the keychain more closely. It was old, the metal corroded in places, but the initials were clear enough. Her mind raced with possibilities. This couldn't be a coincidence. Duke finding something belonging to one of the detectives who had helped put her father behind bars. "This could help Dad," she said softly, hope blooming in her chest for the first time in weeks. Duke's tail wagged slightly as he finished his meal, and he moved to sit beside her, pressing against her leg in silent support. Sarah spent the next few hours pacing her room, the keychain clutched in her hand. She knew she needed to act carefully. This might be their only chance to prove her father's innocence. Duke watched her from his position by the door, his eyes never leaving her. As darkness fell, Sarah made her decision. She couldn't wait any longer. She pulled on dark clothes and comfortable shoes, tucking the keychain into her pocket. "Ready, boy?" she whispered to Duke, who immediately stood at attention. They slipped out of the house quietly, Sarah leaving a note for her aunt claiming she couldn't sleep, and went for a walk with Duke. The streets were empty as they made their way toward her father's auto shop, staying in the shadows as much as possible. The familiar sight of the shop made Sarah's heart ache. Yellow police tape still crossed the entrance, and the windows were dark. Duke led her around to the back entrance, where Sarah used her spare key to let them in. The smell of oil and rubber hit her nose, familiar scents that reminded her of happier times with her father. Duke moved purposefully through the darkness, his nails clicking softly on the concrete floor. Sarah followed, using her phone's flashlight to illuminate their path. The beam caught dust motes dancing in the air and glinted off toolboxes and car parts. They reached a stack of old tires in the corner of the shop. Duke stopped, his nose working overtime as he sniffed around the base of the pile. Sarah knelt beside him, running her hand over his back. "Is this where you found it, boy?" she whispered. Duke whined softly in response, pawing at the ground near the tires. Sarah's heart raced as she examined the area. The concrete floor showed signs of recent disturbance, scratch marks that must have been from Duke's determined digging. She moved closer, shining her light into the spaces between the tires. Duke stood guard beside her, his ears perked forward and his body tense. Every few moments he would turn his head toward the shop's entrance, listening for any sign of approach. Sarah felt safer knowing he was watching out for her. The beam of her flashlight caught something in the shadows behind the tires. Sarah reached forward, her fingers trembling slightly as she touched the rough surface of the concrete. There was a slight depression there, almost like a seam. Her breath quickened as she realized what she might have found. Duke pressed closer to her side. his warm presence giving her courage as she investigated further in the darkness of the auto shop, the weight of the keychain in her pocket serving as a reminder of why they were there. Sarah's hands trembled as she worked the crowbar against the floorboards where Duke had led her. The German shepherd stood alert beside her, his ears perked up and his eyes scanning the darkness of the auto shop. The familiar scents of motor oil and rubber filled the air, but now they seemed somehow threatening in the midnight gloom. "Come on," Sarah whispered, her arms straining as she finally pried loose the wooden plank. Duke whined softly, nudging her arm with his nose. The beam from her flashlight revealed a small cavity beneath the floor, and there, wrapped in an old, oily rag, was something that made her heart skip a beat. Sarah reached down, her fingers closing around a small recording device. It was dusty and looked old, but when she pressed the power button, a small green light flickered to life. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized what she might have found. Duke's warm presence pressed against her side as she sat cross-legged on the cold concrete floor. With shaking fingers, she pressed play, and the silence of the shop was broken by a crackle of static. "Can't keep this up forever." The voice that emerged from the speaker was distorted but unmistakable. "Detective Calloway." Sarah's stomach clenched as she listened more intently. "The businessman was getting suspicious," another voice said. "We had no choice." "But Hayes?" Calloway's voice again, tense and uncertain. "He's innocent. I've known him since we were kids." "That's exactly why it's perfect. Nobody would suspect us of framing an old friend. We plant the evidence, make it look clean. The case closes, and our operation continues." Sarah's free hand curled into a fist as she listened. Duke growled softly beside her, his hackles rising at the sound of Calloway's voice. "The blood on his tools?" Calloway asked. "Already taken care of. The gun, too. Wiped clean except for Hayes' prints. Perfect setup." The recording continued, revealing more details about their illegal dealings with the murdered businessman, how they had orchestrated the entire frame-up. Sarah's mind raced as she realized what she was hearing. Absolute proof of her father's innocence. "Shut up!" Calloway suddenly hissed on the recording. "Someone's coming!" The recording ended with a burst of static. Sarah sat there in the darkness, clutching the device to her chest. Her hands were shaking, but now it was with anger rather than fear. All this time, her father had been rotting in prison while these corrupt officers walked free. Duke's head suddenly snapped up, his ears forward. A low growl rumbled in his chest. Not at the recording this time, but at something else. Sarah quickly switched off her flashlight, plunging the shop into darkness. She stuffed the recorder into her jacket pocket and got to her feet as quietly as possible. Duke's growl grew slightly louder, and Sarah could feel the tension in his body as he pressed against her leg. "We need to get out of here, boy," she whispered, placing a hand on his broad back. They made their way toward the shop's exit, Duke leading the way through the darkness. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she thought about what she had just discovered. This recording could save her father's life. She just needed to get it to the right people. As they reached the door, Sarah heard it, footsteps crunching on gravel outside. Duke's growl deepened, and she felt him shift into a defensive stance beside her. The footsteps grew closer, steady and deliberate. Sarah pressed herself against the wall beside the door, one hand buried in Duke's fur, the other clutching the recorder in her pocket. The weight of it seemed to burn against her side, a precious secret that could change everything. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. Duke's muscles tensed under Sarah's hand, ready to protect her at any cost. She held her breath, trying to quiet the thunder of her heartbeat in her ears. Through the crack under the door, she could see the shadow of someone standing there, waiting. Duke's growl rumbled through the darkness like distant thunder, a warning to whoever lurked outside. Sarah's mind raced. The back door was too far. They'd never make it without being heard. The windows were all locked. They were trapped, with only Duke standing between her and whoever was out there. She clutched the recorder tighter, knowing that she couldn't let it fall into the wrong hands. Not when they were so close to proving her father's innocence. The door handle began to turn, moving slowly, deliberately. Duke's growl grew louder, his powerful body coiled and ready to spring. Sarah's pulse raced as she watched the handle complete its rotation, knowing that in moments, everything would change. Sarah clutched the recorder tightly against her chest as she hurried down the dark streets toward her new home. Duke trotted beside her, his powerful body tense and alert. Every shadow made her jump, and every distant sound had her looking over her shoulder. The weight of what she'd discovered pressed heavily on her mind, the evidence that could finally free her father. As they rounded the corner onto her street, Duke suddenly stopped. His ears flattened against his head, and a low growl rumbled in his throat. Sarah's steps faltered as she spotted a dark sedan parked across from her house, its headlights dimmed, but still visible in the pre-dawn darkness. "Easy, boy," she whispered, placing a trembling hand on Duke's fur. The dog's muscles were rigid under her touch. Someone was watching them, watching her house. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she tried to appear casual, walking quickly but not running. The recorder felt like it was burning through her jacket pocket. Duke stayed close to her side, his protective instincts on high alert as they approached the front door. With shaking hands, Sarah fumbled with her keys. The metallic jingling seemed too loud in the quiet morning air. She could feel eyes on her from the car across the street, but she forced herself not to look. After what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, she got the door open. Sarah practically fell inside, Duke right behind her. She slammed the door shut and engaged every lock, her breathing coming in short, panicked gasps. The house was dark and silent, but it didn't feel safe anymore. Not with that car outside. She pulled the recorder from her pocket and stared at it. The small device held the truth. Calloway's voice admitting to everything. Her hands were trembling so badly, she almost dropped it. Duke paced restlessly near the window, letting out occasional low growls. "We've got them," she whispered, more to steady herself than anything else. Sarah pulled out her phone and accessed the voice identification program she'd downloaded earlier. The recording had clearly captured Calloway's partner's voice. Within minutes, she had his private number. Sarah took several deep breaths, trying to calm her racing heart. Then she dialed. The phone rang 3 times before a gruff voice answered. "Hello?" Sarah kept her voice steady, though her insides were quaking. "I have the recording from the auto shop." There was a long pause. When he spoke again, his voice had an edge to it. "Who is this?" "Someone who knows what really happened," Sarah said. "Someone who knows you and Calloway killed that businessman and framed my She caught herself just in time. Framed an innocent man. "Listen here," he started, but Sarah cut him off. "No, you listen. Stop what you're doing. Call off the execution, or this recording goes to every news station and law enforcement agency in the state." She hung up before he could respond, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped the phone. Duke was at the window again, his growl deeper now, more threatening. The phone rang less than a minute later. Sarah's stomach lurched when she saw Calloway's name on the screen. She answered, but said nothing. "You're playing a very dangerous game, Sarah." Calloway's voice was cold, all pretense of friendship gone. "You have no idea what you're getting into." I know exactly what I'm getting into, Sarah shot back, though her voice wavered. I know what you did. I have proof. Think very carefully about your next move, Calloway said. Things can get very unpleasant very quickly, for you and for your father. Accidents happen in prison all the time. The threat hung in the air like poison. Sarah's grip tightened on the phone. You won't get away with this. We already have. His voice was flat, emotionless. Stay quiet, destroy that recording, and maybe your father will live long enough to serve his sentence. Push this, and neither of you will survive the week. The line went dead. Sarah stood frozen, the phone still pressed to her ear. Duke's growling had grown louder, more insistent. She forced herself to move to the window and peek through the curtains. The car was still there, its dark shape a menacing presence in the growing morning light. Her hands were shaking as she took the recorder and hid it carefully under her mattress, securing it where it wouldn't be easily found. Duke followed her every movement, his protective instinct in overdrive. He stationed himself near the window, his powerful body tense and ready. Sarah checked the window again. The car hadn't moved. Her mind raced with the weight of her situation. She had the evidence to free her father, but using it could get them both killed. Calloway and his partner were clearly willing to do anything to keep their secret. She sank down onto her bed, the morning sun now streaming through the windows. Duke came to her side, resting his head on her knee. She buried her fingers in his fur, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "What do we do now, boy?" she whispered. The clock on her bedside table showed it was nearly noon. Time was running out, but one wrong move could cost everything. She needed to find a way to expose the truth while staying one step ahead of Calloway's deadly game. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Jonathan Hayes shuffled down the sterile corridor of death row. The handcuffs bit into his wrists, a cold reminder of where this journey would end. 2 guards flanked him, their faces carefully blank, trained to show no emotion on execution day. "Keep moving, Hayes," the taller guard said, his voice unexpectedly gentle. Jonathan's legs felt like lead as they approached the execution chamber. The room was smaller than he'd imagined, clinical and cold, dominated by a single gurney with leather restraints. His breath caught in his throat at the sight of the IV stand, its metal surface reflecting the harsh overhead lights. "Dad," Sarah's voice echoed from somewhere beyond the thick walls. "This isn't over. Do you hear me? We're not giving up." Jonathan closed his eyes, his daughter's words piercing his heart. Even now, after everything, her faith in him never wavered. The guards guided him to sit in a holding cell adjacent to the chamber, where he would wait for the final preparations. Outside the prison walls, Sarah Hayes burst through the courthouse doors, her face flushed with determination. Her lawyer, Patricia Martinez, struggled to keep up with her client's frantic pace. "We have evidence?" Sarah's voice bounced off the marble walls as she pushed past security. "New evidence that proves my father's innocence." The courthouse security tried to block her path, but Patricia stepped forward, her credentials already in hand. "We have an emergency motion to stay the execution. This is time-sensitive. A man's life is at stake." Inside the judge's chambers, Sarah's hands shook as she presented the recorder. "Detective Calloway and his partner. They're the real killers. They framed my father to cover up their own crime. It's all here, Your Honor." The judge, a stern-faced woman in her 60s, listened to the recording with growing concern. Her fingers drummed against her desk as Calloway's voice filled the room, the confession clear despite the distortion. "This is extremely serious evidence," the judge said, reaching for her phone. "We need to contact the governor immediately." In the governor's office, politics clashed with justice. The governor paced behind his desk, His face creased with worry as his advisors argued around him. Staying in execution was no small matter. It could cost him votes, support, maybe even his career. "Sir," his chief of staff urged, "think about the optics. If we're wrong about this—" "And if we're right?" the governor shot back. "What about the optics of executing an innocent man?" Back in the execution chamber, the preparations continued with mechanical precision. Jonathan watched as the medical team checked the IV lines, their movements practiced and efficient. His heart thundered in his chest, each beat a countdown to what seemed inevitable. "Hayes," the warden said, appearing at the cell door, "it's time." Jonathan's legs nearly gave out as they led him to the gurney. The leather straps felt cold against his skin as they secured him in place. He tried to focus on breathing, on staying calm, but his mind kept returning to Sarah, his beautiful, brave daughter who never stopped fighting for him. The medical team worked methodically, finding a vein, preparing the injection site. Jonathan could feel the cold swipe of alcohol on his arm, the sharp sting of the needle. The clock on the wall showed 4:30 p.m., 30 minutes until the scheduled execution. In the courthouse, Sarah sat in a small office, her phone clutched in her trembling hands. Every minute that passed was another minute closer to losing her father forever. Patricia paced the room, making call after call, pushing every legal lever she could reach. "The judge is reviewing everything now," Patricia assured her. "She's speaking directly with the governor's office." Sarah's eyes never left the clock. But will it be enough? Will it be in time? The warden stood at the observation window, phone in hand, waiting. The execution team hovered near their stations, watching for his signal. Jonathan lay strapped to the gurney, his heart pounding so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. "Please," he whispered, not sure if he was praying or just speaking to the empty air. "Please let Sarah be okay after this." The minute hand crept forward. 25 minutes until the scheduled execution. The IV dripped steadily, and Jonathan could feel each cold drop entering his vein. He tried to think of happy memories, teaching Sarah to ride a bike, working on cars together in his shop, Duke's faithful presence through the years. But the sterile reality of the execution chamber kept intruding. Sarah's phone buzzed, making her jump. Patricia grabbed it, her face tense as she listened. The judge was still deliberating, weighing the evidence against the ticking clock. In the background, they could hear raised voices arguing about procedure, about justice, about time. The warden's phone rang, the sound sharp in the quiet chamber. Jonathan held his breath, every muscle in his body tense. The leather straps creaked as he strained to hear the conversation, to catch any hint of his fate in the warden's expression. 20 minutes remained. The execution team stood ready. Jonathan closed his eyes, feeling the cold sweat on his forehead, the trembling in his hands. He thought of Sarah, of her unwavering belief in his innocence, of her fierce determination to save him. The clock continued its relentless march forward. 15 minutes now. The warden remained by the phone, his face unreadable. In the courthouse, Sarah paced the small office, her footsteps echoing off the walls. Time seemed to move both too quickly and too slowly, each second stretching into eternity while the minutes flew past. "Stay strong, Hayes," one of the guards whispered, almost too quietly to hear. Jonathan lay there, strapped down, waiting. The IV dripped steadily. His heart continued its frantic rhythm. Outside these walls, his daughter fought for his life. Inside, all he could do was breathe and wait and hope. The execution chamber's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across Jonathan's face as he lay strapped to the gurney. The leather restraints felt tight against his wrists and ankles, and the steady beep of the heart monitor echoed his racing pulse. 3 minutes remained on the large digital clock mounted on the sterile white wall. A technician worked methodically to insert the IV line into his arm, the cold metal of the needle pressing against his skin. Jonathan closed his eyes, trying to block out the clinical preparations for his death. His thoughts drifted to Sarah, his beautiful daughter who had fought so hard to save him. A single tear rolled down his cheek as he whispered a quiet prayer, not for himself, but for her strength in the days to come. 2 minutes, announced the warden, his voice steady and professional. Jonathan could hear the shuffle of feet as the witnesses settled into their chairs behind the glass partition. The air felt thick with tension, and the antiseptic smell of the chamber burned his nostrils. His heart thundered in his chest as reality crashed over him. These were supposed to be his final moments. The technician stepped back, having completed the IV setup. Jonathan could feel the cold liquid beginning to flow through the tube, though not yet the lethal cocktail that would end his life. His breathing became shallow as panic threatened to overwhelm him. 1 minute, came the warden's voice again. Jonathan tried to focus on happy memories, Sarah's first steps, teaching her to ride a bike, working together in the auto shop with Duke keeping watch. The thought of his faithful dog brought a slight smile to his lips, even now. Suddenly, a commotion erupted in the hallway outside. Raised voices and hurried footsteps grew louder, more urgent. Jonathan's eyes snapped open as the heavy metal door burst open with a bang. "Stop! Stop everything!" His lawyer rushed into the room, waving a document above her head. Her face was flushed from running, her usually neat suit wrinkled. "I have a stay of execution from the judge." The warden quickly moved forward, grabbing the paper from her outstretched hand. His eyes scanned the document rapidly, then widened. "Hold everything," he barked to the technician. "Remove the 4 immediately." The room erupted into controlled chaos. Guards rushed forward to assist the technician in carefully removing the IV from Jonathan's arm. The warden spoke rapidly into his radio, confirming the stay order. Jonathan lay there, stunned, barely able to process what was happening. His chest heaved as he took in deep gulps of air, the reality slowly sinking in. He wasn't going to die today. "The evidence," his lawyer was explaining breathlessly to the warden. "Sarah found new evidence. The judge is reopening the case. The death sentence is suspended pending further investigation." Jonathan's restraints were being unbuckled now, gentle hands helping him sit up on the gurney. His legs felt weak, his whole body trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline. He could hear more commotion in the hallway, familiar footsteps running toward the chamber. "Dad!" Sarah's voice carried through the open door, full of desperate hope. "Dad!" The sound of her voice broke through his shock. Jonathan's head snapped toward the doorway just as it swung open wide. Sarah stood there, her face tear-streaked, but radiant with joy. Behind her, Duke's tall form filled the doorway, his tail wagging furiously as he caught sight of Jonathan. Sarah rushed forward, practically leaping onto the gurney to throw her arms around her father. Jonathan wrapped his arms around her tightly, burying his face in her hair as tears finally flowed freely. His daughter's familiar scent, strawberry shampoo and something uniquely Sarah, grounded him in the moment. "You did it," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "You never gave up on me." Sarah pulled back just enough to look into his eyes, her own shining with tears. "We did it, Dad. Duke and I found the evidence. We found the truth." Duke padded over to them, his nails clicking on the tile floor. He pressed his nose against Jonathan's hand, whining softly. Jonathan reached out to scratch behind the dog's ears, amazed at how his faithful companion had helped save his life. The warden cleared his throat respectfully. "Mr. Hayes, we'll need to process some paperwork. but you'll be moved back to regular holding while your case is reviewed. Your lawyer can explain the next steps." Jonathan nodded, still holding Sarah close. His mind was spinning, trying to catch up with how quickly everything had changed. Just minutes ago, he had been preparing for death. Now, hope bloomed in his chest. Hope for justice, hope for freedom, hope for a future with his daughter.
Sarah wiped her eyes, sitting back, but keeping one hand firmly clasped in his. "I was so scared we wouldn't make it in time," she admitted softly.
"But you did," Jonathan assured her, squeezing her hand. "You never lost faith." Duke sat at attention beside them, his presence steady and protective as always. The German shepherd's eyes never left Jonathan's face, as if making sure his beloved human was truly safe. The lawyer stepped forward, her professional demeanor returning now that the immediate crisis had passed. "We have a lot of work ahead of us, but this is a huge victory. The new evidence Sarah and Duke uncovered is compelling. We have a real chance at full exoneration now." Jonathan took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the death sentence lifting from his shoulders. He was alive. He was with his daughter. And for the first time since his arrest, he felt real hope that the truth would finally come to light. The room that had been prepared for his death was now filled with the promise of life. As Sarah helped him stand on shaky legs, with Duke pressing supportively against his side, Jonathan felt overwhelming gratitude wash over him. His prayer had been answered, not just for Sarah's strength, but for the chance to keep fighting for justice together. The afternoon sun filtered through the tall courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Jonathan Hayes sat in the front row, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, watching as Detective Richard Calloway was escorted into the courtroom by two stern-faced officers. Sarah pressed close to her father's side, Duke lying faithfully at their feet. The courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations. Journalists scribbled frantically in their notepads, their pens scratching against paper. Camera shutters clicked rapidly as Calloway was led to the defendant's table, his usually confident stride now reduced to uncertain steps. "All rise," called the bailiff, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "The Honorable Judge Margaret Wilson, presiding." The judge took her seat, her expression grave as she surveyed the packed courtroom. "You may be seated," she announced, shuffling through the papers before her. "We're here today to address new evidence in the case of the state versus Jonathan Hayes, and to hear charges against Detective Richard Calloway." Jonathan's lawyer stood, her posture confident as she approached the bench. "Your Honor, we have conclusive evidence that will not only exonerate Mr. Hayes, but will prove Detective Calloway's direct involvement in the murder of Michael Davidson." The prosecutor rose to his feet. "Your Honor, the state moves to present the recording discovered by Sarah Hayes." Judge Wilson nodded. "Proceed." A court technician wheeled in an audio system, and Sarah squeezed her father's hand as the recording began to play. Calloway's voice filled the courtroom, clear and unmistakable. "We need to make this look clean," Calloway's recorded voice said. "Hayes' shop is perfect. Plant the evidence there. His fingerprints are all over the place anyway. Nobody will question it." Another voice responded, "But what about Hayes? He's your friend." "Friend?" Calloway's laugh was cold. "This is about survival. Davidson was going to expose everything, the kickbacks, the evidence tampering, all of it. Hayes is collateral damage." The recording continued, detailing the conspiracy in brutal clarity. Calloway's face grew increasingly pale as his own words condemned him. In the gallery, several people gasped at the revelations. Sarah watched as Calloway suddenly bolted from his chair, making a desperate dash for the side door. But he didn't make it 3 steps before court officers tackled him to the ground. The impact echoed through the stunned courtroom. Order! Order in the court! Judge Wilson's gavel cracked against the wooden block. As the officers dragged Calloway back to his seat, he locked eyes with Jonathan. Gone was the cold calculation that had sent an innocent man to death row. Instead, there was only defeat and the haunting recognition of his own betrayal. The prosecutor approached Calloway. "Detective Calloway, would you care to explain to the court why you framed an innocent man for murder?" Calloway's lawyer jumped up. "Your Honor, I advise my client to remain silent." But Calloway shook his head. The fight had left him. "No," he said, his voice hollow. "It's over." He looked at Jonathan, his former friend. "I did it, all of it. The murder, the frame-up, everything. Davidson was going to expose our operation. Years of taking bribes, tampering with evidence, letting criminals walk free for the right price." He swallowed hard. "Jonathan was convenient. I knew his shop, knew his routine. It was easy to plant the evidence." The jury didn't need long to deliberate. Within an hour, they returned with their verdict. The forewoman stood, her voice clear and strong. "We find the defendant, Richard Calloway, guilty of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and obstruction of justice." Judge Wilson's gavel fell one final time. "Detective Richard Calloway, you are hereby remanded into custody pending sentencing. Officers, remove the defendant." As Calloway was led away in handcuffs, his shoulders slumped in defeat, Jonathan and Sarah sat in stunned silence. Duke's tail thumped softly against the floor, as if he too understood the magnitude of what had just happened. The judge turned to Jonathan. "Mr. Hayes, on behalf of the state, I offer our deepest apologies for this grave miscarriage of justice. You are hereby fully exonerated of all charges. Court is adjourned." The courtroom erupted in activity. Journalists rushed for the doors, eager to break the story. Lawyers gathered their papers, and the gallery began to empty. But Jonathan and Sarah remained seated, letting the reality of the moment wash over them. Sarah wrapped her arms around her father, tears streaming down her face. "It's over, Dad. It's really over." Jonathan held his daughter close, his own eyes wet with tears. Duke pressed his nose against their legs, offering his own form of comfort. Through the courthouse windows, the evening sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, a fitting end to this chapter of their lives. As they finally stood to leave, Jonathan paused to look around the now empty courtroom. The same room that had once sentenced him to death had now given him back his life. He took Sarah's hand, and together with Duke, they walked toward the courthouse doors, stepping into the early evening air as free people, justice finally served. The heavy courthouse doors swung open, and Jonathan Hayes stepped into the warm evening sunlight. He paused for a moment, squinting against the golden rays that painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. After months in the darkness of his cell, the simple act of feeling the sun on his face felt like a miracle. Sarah's arms wrapped around him tightly, her tears soaking into his shirt. "We did it, Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "We really did it." Jonathan held his daughter close, savoring the feeling of having her in his arms again. His own eyes welled with tears as he stroked her hair, remembering all the nights he'd dreamed of this moment, never quite sure if it would come true. Duke sat at their feet, his tail wagging slowly as he watched over his reunited family. His chest was puffed out proudly, as if he knew the vital role he'd played in bringing the truth to light. "Mr. Hayes! Mr. Hayes!" The shouts from reporters broke through their private moment. A wave of journalists surged forward, microphones extended like spears. cameras flashing like lightning in the evening light. Jonathan instinctively pulled Sarah closer, momentarily overwhelmed by the onslaught of attention. "How does it feel to be free?" one reporter called out. "What are your thoughts on Detective Calloway's arrest?" another shouted. "Will you be pursuing legal action against the state?" The questions came rapid fire, echoing off the courthouse walls. Jonathan felt his heart racing, the crowd pressing in around them. Duke moved closer, positioning himself between the family and the reporters, his protective instincts kicking in. Taking a deep breath, Jonathan raised his hand, and surprisingly, the crowd fell quiet. "I'd like to make a statement," he said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. Sarah squeezed his hand in support. "Today, justice has finally been served," Jonathan began, his words clear and measured. "But I'm not the only innocent person behind bars. There are others out there, fighting the same battle I fought, hoping someone will believe in their innocence." He paused, looking down at Sarah and Duke. "I was blessed to have an incredible daughter who never stopped fighting for me, and a loyal companion who helped uncover the truth." The cameras turned to Duke, who sat regally beside Jonathan, his intelligent eyes scanning the crowd. Several reporters cooed and pointed their cameras at the German Shepherd, recognizing him as the hero dog who had found the crucial evidence. "Duke here," Jonathan continued, placing his hand on the dog's head, "proved that sometimes the truth has an unexpected way of coming to light. He never doubted me, never gave up, and in the end, he helped save my life." Duke's tail wagged faster at the mention of his name, and he looked up at Jonathan with devoted eyes. The cameras clicked rapidly, capturing the touching moment between man and dog. "Mr. Hayes," a reporter called out, "what are your plans now?" Jonathan smiled, looking at Sarah. "We're going to start fresh. Find a new town, build a new life. But I won't forget what happened here. I plan to work with organizations that help wrongfully convicted individuals. No one should have to go through what we did." Sarah beamed up at him, pride shining in her eyes. "We're going somewhere where we can just be ourselves again," she added, her voice strong and clear. "Somewhere we can heal." The reporters continued to call out questions, but Jonathan felt a sudden urge to leave the chaos behind. He nodded politely to the crowd and began guiding Sarah toward their waiting car. Duke followed faithfully, maintaining his protective position. As they walked away from the courthouse steps, the evening breeze carried away the sound of clicking cameras and shouted questions. Jonathan felt lighter with each step, as if the weight of his ordeal was finally lifting from his shoulders. Sarah's hand remained firmly in his as they walked. "You know what, Dad?" she said softly. "For the first time in forever, I feel like I can breathe again." Jonathan understood exactly what she meant. The air itself seemed sweeter, the world brighter. Even the simple act of walking to their car felt like a gift. A freedom he'd feared he'd never experience again. Duke trotted alongside them, his head held high, occasionally glancing up at his family as if checking that they were still together. His presence was a constant reminder of the unbreakable bond that had helped them survive their darkest days. They reached their car just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the parking lot. The courthouse loomed behind them, but Jonathan didn't look back. Instead, he focused on Sarah's smile, on Duke's wagging tail, on the promise of tomorrow. For the first time since his arrest, Jonathan felt truly certain about something. They would be okay. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, their bond stronger than ever. As he opened the car door for Sarah and Duke, Jonathan felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. They had each other, and that was all that mattered. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink as Jonathan steered their car away from the courthouse. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, still getting used to the feeling of freedom. Sarah sat beside him in the passenger seat, while Duke lounged contentedly in the back, his head occasionally popping up to look out the window. The familiar streets of their old town began to fade away, each turn taking them further from the painful memories of the past months. Jonathan glanced at his daughter, noticing how the golden light caught the tears glistening in her eyes. "You okay, sweetheart?" he asked softly. Sarah nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "Yeah, Dad, I can't believe it's really over." Duke let out a gentle whine from the back seat, as if agreeing with her sentiment. Jonathan reached back with one hand to pat the loyal dog's head. "We wouldn't be here without you two," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You never gave up on me." The car radio hummed quietly in the background, but the peaceful moment was interrupted by a news bulletin. Breaking news: former Detective Richard Calloway has been arrested in connection with the murder of local businessman James Morton. This development led to the exoneration of Jonathan Hayes, who was wrongfully convicted and sentenced to death. Sarah quickly reached forward and turned off the radio. "We don't need to hear that anymore," she said firmly. Jonathan nodded gratefully. They drove in comfortable silence, watching as unfamiliar landscapes rolled past their windows. The sun continued its descent, casting long shadows across the road ahead. Duke had settled down, his chin resting on his paws, occasionally lifting his head to sniff the fresh air coming through the slightly opened windows. As they passed through a small town, they caught glimpses of their story playing on television screens and shop windows. People on the streets pointed at their car, recognizing them from the news coverage. Jonathan kept driving, focused on the road ahead. "Look," Sarah said, pointing to her phone. "The governor just released a statement. He's promising to reform the justice system to prevent what happened to you from happening to anyone else." Jonathan's jaw tightened slightly. "That's good," he said quietly. "But it doesn't change what we went through." Sarah reached over and squeezed his arm. "No, it doesn't. But maybe it'll help someone else." Their phones buzzed repeatedly, with incoming calls from reporters and news stations, all wanting exclusive interviews about their story. They let the calls go to voicemail, choosing instead to focus on the peaceful moment they were sharing. Duke suddenly perked up in the back seat, his tail wagging as they passed a sign for a roadside diner. Jonathan couldn't help but smile. It was the first time he'd seen the dog so animated since they'd left the courthouse. "Should we stop for dinner?" he asked, already knowing the answer from Duke's eager expression in the rearview mirror. Sarah laughed, a sound that made Jonathan's heart swell with joy. "I think Duke's vote is pretty clear." They pulled into the nearly empty parking lot, grateful for the lack of people. As they stepped out of the car, Duke stretched his legs and shook himself, seeming to enjoy the cool evening air. The sky had deepened to a rich purple, with just a hint of orange still lingering on the horizon. Back in the car after their meal, the atmosphere felt lighter somehow. Duke had been treated like a celebrity by the few patrons in the diner, and he now lay contentedly in the back seat, still wearing the bandana the waitress had given him as a gift. As they continued their journey, the lights of their old town disappeared completely in the rearview mirror. Jonathan felt a weight lift from his shoulders as the distance grew. The road ahead was dark, but full of possibility. No more prison walls, no more death row, no more fighting to prove his innocence. Sarah had dozed off in the passenger seat, her head resting against the window. Duke kept watch over her from the back seat, his protective instincts never wavering. Jonathan glanced at them both, his family, finally together and safe. The car's headlights cut through the growing darkness, illuminating the path ahead. Every mile marker they passed felt like another step toward their fresh start. The night was peaceful, broken only by the gentle hum of the engine and Duke's occasional contented sighs. As they approached 9 o'clock, Jonathan caught one final glimpse of their old town's lights in the distance. They were barely visible now, just a faint glow on the horizon. He didn't feel sadness or anger anymore, just a quiet acceptance and readiness to move forward. The road stretched endlessly before them, leading them toward their new beginning. For the first time since his arrest, Jonathan felt truly free. The future, once so dark and uncertain, now lay open before them, full of possibilities. Duke's steady presence in the back seat and Sarah's peaceful sleeping form beside him were all he needed to know that everything would be all right. Jonathan and Sarah returned to their old home, finding it frozen in time. The memories were intact, but they no longer fit the life they once knew. A visit from their kind neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, was a rare moment of warmth. But Jonathan knew deep down, their home had become a relic of the past. A walk through town confirmed what they feared. Old friends hesitated, some avoided eye contact, others whispered behind their backs. Sarah burned with frustration at the unfairness, but Jonathan knew, no matter how much they fought it, the past would always cast a shadow here. Seeking closure, Jonathan confronted Richard Calloway in prison. The man who had framed him was unapologetic, dismissing his actions as just business. Rage threatened to consume Jonathan, but Duke's quiet presence anchored him. He left, not with revenge, but with the knowledge that Calloway's consequences were now his own to bear. Back home, Jonathan and Sarah studied a map, debating where to go. The weight of the town's judgment made the decision clear. "Let's go where people see us for who we are now," Sarah said. Jonathan finally agreed. It was time to move on. Packing up was emotional. They kept only what mattered: family photos, a chipped coffee mug, Duke's old tennis ball. The prison-issued boots, left behind. Their house, once filled with love and routine, was now just walls and memories. With one final glance, Jonathan locked the door for the last time. On the open road, silence was peaceful rather than tense. Sarah hummed along to old country songs. Duke lay relaxed in the back seat, and Jonathan let the miles roll away, the weight of their past. The future stretched ahead like an endless highway, full of possibilities. That future took them to Pine Valley, a quiet mountain town where no one knew their story. A charming blue house with a sprawling backyard caught their eye, and its kind-hearted landlord welcomed them without hesitation. Sarah found excitement in a new school, while neighbors greeted them with genuine kindness, bringing bread and honey rather than judgment. Sitting on their new porch that evening, watching the stars emerge over the mountains, Jonathan and Sarah felt something unfamiliar: peace. Here, they weren't a wrongfully convicted man and his daughter fighting to be believed. Here, they were simply a family, free to begin again. Jonathan Hayes had once thought freedom meant walking out of prison, but he soon realized it was about something deeper: rebuilding a life with his daughter Sarah and their loyal German shepherd Duke. At Miller's auto shop, Jonathan found more than a job. He found acceptance. Mike, the shop's owner, saw his skill, not his past, offering him mentorship and a fresh start. Meanwhile, Sarah flourished at her new school, forming friendships and embracing normal teenage life. Their once vigilant dog, Duke, adjusted too, trading restless nights for naps in the sun. Small victories became milestones. Sarah's laughter filled their home again. Duke no longer stood guard every night, instead curling by the fireplace, content. Jonathan still battled nightmares of the execution chamber, but morning walks with Duke helped ease his mind. One night, as Sarah joked about math homework, they both laughed, a sound that felt like healing. Then came the letter, an official apology from the state, accompanied by compensation. Jonathan realized it wasn't about money, but acknowledgement. Sarah, always wise beyond her years, suggested using it to help others, a foundation for the wrongfully convicted, a college fund, and maybe, just maybe, a garage of his own. Jonathan also began working on his memoir, partnering with writer Margaret Wilson. "Your story isn't just about injustice," she told him. "It's about faith, loyalty, and love." Inspired, he started writing letters to inmates still fighting for justice, using his experience to offer hope. As the town embraced them, Jonathan and Sarah found belonging in the simplest moments: dinners at the local diner, friendly nods from neighbors, and shared plans for the future. Sarah joined the school debate team, arguing passionately for criminal justice reform, while Jonathan spoke at community events. His past no longer defined him; his purpose did. On quiet nights, they sat by the fire, Duke resting at their feet, a silent protector who had never given up on them. One evening, standing under a sky full of stars, Sarah took Jonathan's hand and whispered, "We can finally just live." Jonathan exhaled, feeling it deep in his soul. Freedom wasn't just leaving a prison cell. It was this: the warmth of a home, the trust of a town, the unshakable bond of family. And for the first time in years, he truly believed it. If you enjoyed the story of Jonathan, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.